Welcome back. Today I'm going to be going over my thoughts on who are the best Deadeye users in the game currently. I remember when Lethality initially came out, I made a tier list for that, but I never did the same thing for Deadeye. Although somebody in the comment section did ask me to do it, and I figured, you know what, may as well. It sounds like something that could be fun. So I'll be going over my overall picks and reasonings for their placements. Now I should also preface this by saying just because some unit is higher than others doesn't mean they can't necessarily use Deadeye. Granted, there are exceptions because Deadeye does rely on having an attack stat, which some units just don't have. But that's not all there is to Deadeye. You also have to reliably charge it. You also have to have certain effects that allow you to even get it off. Also, depending on your class type, it will either hold you back or allow you to function really well as a Deadeye user. All of this will make a bunch of sense once I just show you the tier list. So yeah, that's pretty much the rundown of it all. And there's not much else to be said really, so we may as well just get started. Now, I have 5 categories in Innis. I have best users, solid users, okay users, meh users, and the rest. I don't think I necessarily have to explain the tiers per se, but I can just in case. The units in the rest are the ones that generally struggle the most to get Deadeye off, whether that's because of their class type, their attack stat, so on and so forth. There's a lot holding them back from realistically using it to a significant degree, which is why they're in the rest. And as we keep going up to meh, okay, solid, generally they have an easier time using Deadeye, whether that's because, again, their class types or because they have a good attack stat, but there is a lot that goes into this. Because at the end of the day, having high attack will be nice for triggering Deadeye, but it's not the only thing that you need to reliably get it off, which is why the list is how it looks. So we may as well just get started with Innis, I guess. Innis, I'm not really going to go over too much. He's basically the cheat unit in this tier list simply because he has Deadeye built into his weapon. So he doesn't even need to run Deadeye himself. He can just run a 2 cooldown special with time pulls and he'll have the Deadeye effect ready to go. So there's not really much to cover there. Innis is probably one of the best, if not the best, Deadeye users simply because it's built into his weapon. So he has a lot more flexibility with his specials. And then we get to the best users in Duochrome, Legendary Claude, New Year Dagger, Junk, and Euler. So we'll basically go in order. I also have to mention that after best users, we're not really going to be covering every single unit. We're going to be covering a subcategory of each because a lot of it is just going to have a bunch of overlaps, so there isn't really any need to go explain the same set for like 3 different units. But anyway, with Duochrome, basically starts out with a 1 cooldown Deadeye because of Time's Pulse and Destiny Bow having Slang, and then with Change Fate granting accelerated cooldown, he will have an instant Deadeye ready to go, so he doesn't even have to worry about charging it. That on top of the fact that his attack stat is super high, he's not really going to struggle to deal damage whatsoever, which is why he's definitely one of the best users in the game for Deadeye. Again, mainly because he could charge Deadeye with no issue whatsoever to Change Fate in his bow. He'll have it instant ready to go, and because of his armor effectiveness and his weapon, he will also have a really easy time taking down a lot of bulkier threats. Then we have Legendary Claude, who's up here mainly because of his survivability. He gets 80% damage reduction if he initiates combat because of Fallen Star. He has no follow-up and Slaying built into his weapon, meaning that Deadeye starts out with a 2 cooldown special, and even though he can't access Time's Pulse, he doesn't necessarily need it because as long as there aren't any guard effects, he will be able to get Deadeye off on every second hit, which he shouldn't struggle to do because more than likely he's going to be able to double in all scenarios just because his speed stat is really high, and it also helps that he just has a really good attack stat. Next we have New Year Dagger, who is up here for a similar reason as to Legendary Claude. They don't have damage reduction, but they do have massive stat swings in Sun Twin Wing and Jotner Bow. And Jotner Bow also comes with Slang, so they are able to get Deadeye to a 2 cooldown special. But Sun Twin Wing also comes with no follow-up built into it, meaning that they are able to double regardless of the foe's skills as long as they have the natural speed for it. And then their dual skill also grants a bunch of stats, and because of the bonus doubler effect that their bow comes with, they're basically going to become a massive stat ball. Survivability-wise, it's not too bad either. It's not nearly as impressive as Legendary Claude's, obviously, but with sturdy impact and attack defense Rhine, they will be getting a really solid stat swing overall, which is why I have them up here as one of the best users for Deadeye. And then we have Jump, who's honestly a really sleeper hit. He has a slang bow that grants attack speed plus 10, and then a guaranteed follow-up, and Desperation, as long as he meets a speed check. Which is really, really good, because if he pairs it with Time Spells, he'll have a 1 cooldown Deadeye ready to go, meaning that he doesn't even need to run Flashing or Heavy Blade. And then with Speed, Defense, Tempo, which is one of the newer skills that infantry units got, he'll be able to consistently trigger Deadeye because guard effects will not be able to stop him. Combine that with Attack Speed Ideal and Blade Session for more damage output, and he's going to be hitting significantly hard, which is why I also have him up here as one of the best users. And then finally we have Euler, who is in a similar position to Jump, where they have the ability to stack up a bunch of attack and defense. They have Slang, they have no guard. Jump doesn't have no guard, but he can run tempo, which is why they're pretty similar. And then Euler also comes with no follow-up and Time Pulse. So basically they're also starting out with a 1 cooldown Deadeye, meaning that they are able to trigger Deadeye in a very consistent manner. It also helps that they also come with Desperation built into their PRFB, meaning that they don't have to worry about counterattacks as long as there isn't any hardy bearing, but more often than not, there isn't really going to be hardy bearing, especially now that units are prioritizing stacking up stats just to deal with saves, which is why I also have her up here. Her damage output is really, really, really high. Like, you're more than likely not going to be able to take a hit unless you have some sort of, like, hardy fighter, and probably that's it. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, outside of Innis, these are the best 5 users of Deadeye, in my opinion. But then we get to the solid category, which is a bit bloated, but that's for a good reason. I mentioned earlier with Speed, Defense, Tempo, Jump Gate doesn't have to really worry about guard effects, which is really good because with Slang and Time Pulse they'll end up with a 1 cooldown Deadeye. But the same logic can apply with all the generic bow infantries, where they can run Ninja Yumi with Flashing Blade and Tempo and Time Pulse, negate any sort of guard effects, start out with a 2 cooldown Deadeye, and as long as they are able to make a speed check with Ninja Yumi, they'll be able to get 18 points of true damage and Deadeye off on every second hit, which is really, really fantastic. Which is why I also have the likes of Alm, Brigid, Bridal Cordelia, etc., etc. A lot of these units are pretty similar just because of the fact that they end up with a similar stat line because of the flowers that they gain. Granted, some of these units aren't nearly as fast or as powerful, for example, which is why some of them are lower. But I figure that there is a bar to set, and I think Bridal Cordelia kind of sets that bar with 35-35 base before flowers or any sort of merges, which I think is still pretty significant. Comparatively with all the generics, Ninja Shinon is the best one because he ends up having the most attack and the most speed, meaning that he's going to be the most consistent damage dealer with Deadeye and Tempo and all that, which is why I also have a bunch of these generics up here. Legendary Alm is also up here for the same reason. His bow is whatever, but stat-wise he's pretty similar to Shinon and a lot of other units, which is why I also have him up here. The same can also be said for the units with PRFs that, while not necessarily amazing, do have the stat line to make up for it. So, Nami, for example, isn't actually too different from Ninja Shinon. If anything, it's like 1 point of attack and 1 point of speed, but that isn't significant enough for her to be a tier below, which is why I also have her up here. Same with Sorae Nephany, Summer Joshua, Luis, so on and so forth. There are a lot of units, even with PRFs, that can use this generic set and get Deadeye off with minimal issue. Of course, we also have the Fire Sweep users, such as Clarice and Eleanor. They can also do the same thing with Time Spells, Flashing Blade, Low Speed Defense. The benefit to having Fire Sweep is that they don't have to really worry about counterattacks, and their damage output can still be significantly high because they aren't giving up their PRF or a 7 might weapon. So Clarice isn't going to have her brave attacks from Ninja Yumi. She does have the Fire Sweep effect, which does allow her to get Deadeye off on every second hit with Flashing Blade. You may have to run no follow-up in some cases, which is perfectly fine, because it will allow her to double regardless. But you are also giving up the tempo set, but even still, I do find that negating any sort of counterattack is a worthwhile boon on its own, which is why I think the trade-off is more than fair. The same can be said for Eleanor. You pretty much give her the same set. Her offenses aren't actually all too different from Clarice, because Clarice does get an attack speed boost from her weapon, so the deficit isn't also too bad either, which is why they're also not in separate tiers. Mirage Longbow is just a speed check for Fire Sweep, and that's about it. It also grants speed +3, which is fine. But pretty much the same thing. She could use Flashing Blade with Times Pulse and low speed defense or no follow-up or tempo or whatever the case may be. It will allow her to get Deadeye off no matter what, and her offenses are really, really good, so she doesn't really have to worry about not dealing too much damage. The same can also be said about Shamir, who also has a fire sweep weapon. Shamir is probably one of the best fire sweep candidates in my opinion, simply because she has slaying and attack speed 6 in her weapon. She will have to be solo, which is okay, I guess, but because she has slaying, she can run Time's Pulse with tempo, and she doesn't have to worry about running Flashing Blade or Heavy Blade, so she can continue to stack up her offenses really well. And while not completely fire sweep, Legendary Lyn does have a melee sweep skill in her Laws of Decay 2, and Swift Mulligar does grant a bunch of extra stats and true damage, so she does end up dealing a good amount of damage regardless. Laws of Decay 2, it's basically another side grade fire sweep to an extent, but because mages and the like are able to bypass her fire sweep, she won't be nearly as successful. But because of the amount of stats she's getting from her weapon and her A slot, she's going to be outputting a lot more damage comparatively. And then we have the armors, who are also pretty good. The slow armors are definitely going to be able to take advantage of their bulk a lot more, because they can end up running stuff like Spendthrift without the worry of having to trigger Deadeye consistently, because with Spendthrift and Crafty Fighter, so long as the foe is able to double and the unit is able to double, they are able to trigger Deadeye on every second hit, which isn't going to be a problem whatsoever, especially for someone like Halloween Jacob or Valentine Faye, because they do have significantly decent bulk. Of course, for the faster ones, they can also stack the same amount of bulk, but I find that running Savvy Fighter is probably going to be better for them in the long term, simply because they don't have to worry about taking even more damage. But they will have to run something like Slangbow or some sort of support that does allow them to charge Deadeye really fast. But with Slangbow, Deadeye becomes a 2 cooldown special, and so long as they're able to double, which they should be able to provided that they aren't outsped, they will be able to trigger Deadeye on every second hit, which is also really significant. Then we have the bulkier units with Leon and George. Leon has a slaying impact weapon, which is really solid overall because their damage output is able to become really decent, especially when paired with attack speed ideal. Because Leon has slaying in their weapon, they can also run Time's Pulse and Quicken Pulse for an instant Deadeye. And then after that point, they'll have Deadeye ready to go on every combat, which is really nice. You can do the same thing with George, but he'll be relying more on one-shot simply because he doesn't have the same amount of speed, but he does have more bulk. So with Sturdy Impact, Time's Pulse, and Quicken Pulse, George will also be able to get his Deadeye ready to go, because Daniel Made Bow also has Slaying built into it. So damage output-wise, they're going to be doing pretty well. And then outside of that, we have Leguern, who's probably the only exception for Speedy Calves being up here, mainly because they have offensive no follow-up built into their PRF, as well as slaying, meaning that they can charge up Deadeye really easily while preventing any sort of follow-up attacks with Wind Sweep. To an extent, they're pretty much another side-grade Lyn, which is perfectly fine because with Wind Sweep, their survivability is going to be really high. With Heavy Blade, they'll be able to charge Deadeye really quick, but Heavy Blade checks are a bit more difficult comparatively to Flashing Blade. But even so, Leguern does have a lot of attack, so I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue, especially when paired with Attack Speed Catch and Rouse Attack Speed 4. And that's pretty much it for the solid users. Then we get into the OK users, which is a bit of a mix between, they're not necessarily bad per se, but they either can't get Deadeye off consistently, or their stat line is a bit worse than the ones in solid users. Because at some point you do have to draw a line of which units are going to be solid, which ones aren't. So I figured there'd be a cutoff. Legendary Crown may be a weird outlier in the OK users, simply because their damage output is really high. You could speed stack them for doubles and whatnot, but I don't think Legendary Crom is a consistent Deadeye user, simply because they don't have Slaying built into their weapon, and with Time's Pulse it's only a 2 cooldown special, which is fine, but they will have to speed stack to Oblivion or become an enemy phase unit, but at that point it's not really going to be as good as a Ninja Yumi Flashing Blade set in my opinion. Crom can speed stack if you really want him to, but against faster foes, he's probably going to be struggling to double naturally, which is why I don't have him anywhere above OK. And Pirate Hinoka is just a really good unit in general, which is why they're okay. As far as Deadeye is concerned, they do get Brave from their weapon, so they can quad at times, which is pretty significant because if they are able to quad, they will be able to get Deadeye off on every 4th hit, provided that they are able to attack 4 times. But at that point, if you're attacking 4 times and you're not killing, that's probably a different issue. But even so, the Brave in their weapon with the Adaptive does make Deadeye a lot easier to get off, and their damage output becomes even higher as a result. And then we have other generic sets with the same Ninja Yumi Flashing Blade set, it's not really going to be any different. I don't really have to explain it as much because I already did go over it. But basically, Run is just down here because his stat line, while it's still pretty good, isn't nearly as good as the other ones in Solid Users, which is why I did put him here. But that isn't to say he's bad by any means. And a more interesting set you can do with Scion Leaf. I don't really recommend it all too much. You can do it, but basically Bow of 12 does have Slang built into their weapon, meaning it's a 2 cooldown Deadeye. So they are able to get Deadeye off on every second hit, provided that there isn't any guard. But the kicker with Bow of 12 is that it has Miracle built into it if they initiate combat. Meaning that if you were to pair it with Mystic Boost, for example, they won't really have to worry about their survivability all too much because they will be able to eat a hit no matter what. As long as there isn't any dual phase brave or guaranteed follow-ups or whatnot, as long as there isn't any of that, they should be fine. And then we have Sue, who's basically another Fire Sweep user, which is why I also have her up here. Deadeye-wise, it's not going to be the easiest to trigger, but their survivability is going to be really, really high, which is why I do have them up here comparatively to other units. Sure, you can use Fire Sweep Bow on another unit, but their damage output is a lot better comparatively. So I do think that with generic Fire Sweep Bow users with Deadeye, I think there's an argument that you can make with having Sue just okay. And then we have Norn, who is basically going to be doing the same thing. You can run Times Pulse instead of a Slang Bow and then pair it up with Spendthrift instead. It doesn't really matter one way or the other because they do have the flexibility as an infantry unit. So basically you can make them into an enemy phase tank with close foil, no follow-up, and stack the attack defense form. It's not really too bad there. Honestly, you may as well just go with Spendthrift and Times Pulse. I figured Slang with Joint Drive is just going to be a bit more, I guess, consistent. But to be fair, if she has to enter more than one combat, then she's not going to get Deadeye off on every single combat, as opposed to running the Slang Bow set, where she will be able to get it off on every second hit. And that's pretty much it for the OK users. The rest are pretty much going to be running similar stats, like New Year Anna's pretty much just going to be running the same Ninja Yumi set, Midori's probably going to still run the same enemy phase set, and Nina's probably the same way too, so I don't really have to cover those all too much. But then we get into the Mei users, who either have a significantly weaker stat line, or aren't as consistent with their Deadeye procs. So for example, we have Bernadetta, who can run the same Ninja Yumi set, but because she can't run Flashing Blade, she can run Heavy Blade, but it's not going to be as good as Flashing Blade. But also because of the fact that she's a ranged cav, she won't be able to prevent any sort of impact effects, which can be a problem if you need her to quad to get the Deadeye off. But also because she's a cav, she can't run Times Pulse, which does make it harder for her to get Deadeye off on every second hit with something like Heavy Blade. The same thing can be said for Claude. He's basically going to be running the same Ninja Yumi set. It's not really going to be all too different from Bernadetta, it's just that he has one more point of attack. And then we have Brave Claude, who's honestly only up here because of Wind Parthia. Wind Parthia having healing on every special trigger does allow him to act as a generally decent tank, especially when paired with attack speed Rain. So I don't think it's going to be enough to put him in the rest category, but this assumes Claude will either A, not get one shot, or B, there isn't Fatal Smoke, which both of them are real possibilities, but the fact that he has Slang and Healing in his weapon does mean his survivability is a lot better, and he can get Deadeye off consistently because he won't be going down as much. We also have the enemy phase Cavs, who can just run Quick Repose and Close Foil with Deadeye with Spendthrift. They're not going to be fast enough to double themselves, but they'll probably be slow enough to get doubled by the faster foes or the ones that have guaranteed follow-up attack, so it's not going to be too bad. Basically, just stack up attack and defense as much as possible, so you can eat a hit, and then you can output a really heavy hitting Deadeye. For Python, it'll probably be harder to get Deadeye off with the Spendthrift set, because 42 speed is pretty high, which means that he may end up doubling himself, or neither him or the foe will double. So you may have to replace the set entirely, but it can still work against even faster foes, and foes with guaranteed follow-up attacks. And as far as the infantries go, they are also going to be running the same Ninja Yumi Flashing Blade set. Klein is going to be in that category as well, with Flashing Blade 4 times full speed, defense, tempo, yada 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 yada. You get the gist. Basically, he's doing the same thing. Beyond that, that pretty much covers all of them, because everybody else kind of just follows a similar path. Like the Cavs still run Ninja Yumi, the slow units run Spendthrift, yada yada yada, so on and so forth. And then the speedy infantry ones can just run Ninja Yumi. So there's not really a reason to go over all of them. And then we get to the final category with units that just really struggle to get Deadeye off in a consistent manner, or aren't nearly as good as their contemporaries. Faye isn't bad by any means for Deadeye because they do have quick riposte built into their weapon, but everything is tied to range units, meaning that they can't really counterattack against every single unit. They can be paired with near save, but for consistency's sake, Norn is going to end up being a lot better because they could just end up being an Omni tank. They can run no follow up. They don't really have to worry about doubling off too much. They have just better stats overall, which is why I do have Faye and the rest, but honestly, I could probably boost her up to meh. But even still, I find that her stat line overall for our Ninja Yumi set isn't exactly going to be good, so that's why I have her down here. And then we have the slow flyers, such as Juan, who is only going to be able to get Deadeye off on the first combat, provided that A, they can make heavy blade checks, and B, there isn't any guard, which is going to be difficult because Brave Bow is only a 7 might weapon, and while having a high attack set is pretty good, they'll only be able to attack twice, and they rely on quick impulse to get it off, which means they are going to be struggling quite a bit to get Deadeye off consistently. The fast flyers, on the other hand, while they are better in that regard because they can just quad, and they don't really have to worry about running Heavy Blade and Quick Impulse, it's still going to be quite a bit of an issue simply because there are means of preventing quads, and while the cav units are in a similar position, I do find that their range is going to be a bigger asset to them than the flyers, even though the flyers can run reins, which is why I also have them down here. And then we have Roy, who's just another slow cav. His problem mainly stems from the fact that he's going to be weak to impact effects, which is another weakness that Henry does have as well. Python can just double naturally, even with quick riposte, because he has good speed. But I do find that stat-wise, he's just a bit weaker than Python and Henry, even though he has a lot more res. I do find that overall, the Omni-tanking set is just going to benefit more to infantry simply because they have more skills to work with. And I don't think being a cav is just going to help him in any regard. And then we have Brado Luis, who's basically just another weaker Bernadetta and Claude with the Ninja Yumi set. Granted, it's not too much different, but I do think that there has to be a bar somewhere, which is why I put it with Bernadetta and the like. So I do have Luis down here for that reason, even though they're pretty much going to be kind of the same. So take that for what you will. And then for a similar reason, we have the speedy infantry ones with Ninja Yumi. Basically, they just have weaker stats overall. They have the speed, but they don't necessarily have as much attack, which I do think is a lot more important. Speed checks are really easy to make anyway, but the attack set is going to be really important because Deadeye relies on having more attack than the foe's defense, or the foe's res, depending on like the adaptive like Hinoka has. But generally speaking, you do have to have a significant attack set for it to work, which is why I do have Tanya and Virian and like down below, especially Niles, because Niles doesn't really have an attack set. And that's pretty much it for the Deadeye tier list. You'll have to let me know down below what you think overall. Am I being too harsh on the flyers and the cabs? Do you think some should be higher? Do you think some should be lower? Let me know down below. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, thanks for watching.